Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Peterson Institute president, and it's my great privilege to introduce three of my colleagues today, Monica de Bolle, Chad Bown, and Jacob Kirkegaard, to discuss our new Peterson Institute briefing, Economic Policy for a Pandemic Age. And we have just released that after How the World Must Prepare. We have just released this briefing edited by Monica, Maurice Obstfeld, and myself. We will be having a second event with another tranche of our, think of it as your booster dose, your second dose of vaccine for economic policy on Thursday of this week. On Wednesday of this week. Please forgive me. Let me now properly introduce the project and our collaborators. The idea is led by Monica de Bolle. We have been having internal discussions very pointedly about not just the risk of there being a recurrence or persistence of the current pandemic through variants of concern and through insufficiently global vaccination, but about the broader idea that the world is not well prepared despite talking about pandemics and going through this exercise as the ways that every government practically has failed in some ways, even as they've succeeded in others. And in particular, and this is where Maury and I especially come in the ways that the international effort to confront a common health threat has been lacking fundamentally. Our colleagues, Monica, Chad, and Maury, had written a piece, one of the first serious pieces as opposed to emotional pieces, talking about the fact that in economic terms, if we do not contain the contain the pandemic and vaccinate people sufficiently around the world, which means proper trade and distribution of vaccines, we will be imperiling the economic recovery as well as the health of millions. We were very glad to see just now that Secretary Yellen, representing the Biden administration, made her first mention of the idea that getting vaccinations out around the world is a direct impact on the economic well-being of the US, and that the Biden administration has appointed their new coordinator for global vaccine distribution. These are positive signs. These are late, slow, insufficient signs, but they are positive and we welcome them. What we would like to do today is set out the reasons and the way forward to seriously take on responsibility for dealing with vaccines in the international economic policy community, which puts obligations on the G20 countries. Speaking first today will be Monica de Bolle, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for the last 4 years. She's also an adjunct lecturer at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. She actually joined us in March 2015. She has been a major contributor, as many of you know, to public debate in her native Brazil, where she writes a popular column and has had best-selling books. But recently, she mobilized herself in a way few have for the pandemic, and she has moved into public health research, getting certified in immunology and genetics at Harvard Medical School, and recently in her copious free time has enrolled in the MSc PhD program in immunology at Georgetown. Monica will be speaking today about how real the threats are that the pandemic will persist, the pandemic will recur, or other pandemics are around the corner. And this is something that motivates our efforts. Speaking second will be Chad Bown, now recently celebrated his fifth anniversary with the Peterson Institute, I'm proud to say. He is now the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow and is one of the dominant figures in intellectual life around international trade. With Sumaya Keynes of The Economist, he co-hosts, of course, Trade Talks, our first and fabulous podcast on the economics of international trade policy. He's previously been a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, as well as a lead economist at the World Bank, conducting research and advising developing country governments on international trade policy. previously a distinguished professor at Brandeis University. What is, of course, important for today, like Monica, he got out in front. He and his colleague, our colleague, Tom Boyke from Council on Foreign Relations, did a very important work last summer on vaccine nationalism. Taking that term, making it meaningful in economic policy terms, and talking about how to address it. And today he'll be presenting his and Tom's newest work on that topic of how to move the world forward, what kind of treaties, what kind of common actions. Third, we'll be speaking my longtime colleague, Jacob Funk Kirkegaard. Jacob has been with the Peterson Institute for a very long time, almost as long as I have. About a year ago, he moved to Brussels, becoming a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson, and we share him now with our good friends at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he is a resident senior fellow. Jacob has been out in front as well on the issues of pandemic, doing real-time commentary, tracking, and analysis of the disbursement of vaccines in the European context, and how the world's best equipped, most universal healthcare systems have failed or not in this process. And as a sober but real fan of European integration, he also has been bringing us real revelations of the interaction between the member states, the European Commission, and medical realities. And so we're very excited to have Jacob draw lessons and prospects from that as well. Our goal today is not to be simply the usual that Peterson and other policy analysts do. Well, here are lessons from the crisis, so we avoid it next time. It is to tell you the crisis is ongoing. It is to tell you that the crisis needs to be addressed now, still, and that the crisis isn't just getting through this year and this round of vaccinations. It's an ongoing threat. And so our lessons are meant more as a call to action for the G20. A year ago, Maury Obstfeld and I edited a briefing for the G20 about the initial economic response to the crisis. And today we ask, if the pandemic is persistent or recurrent, how do those policy recommendations change? So let me now turn to Monica de Bolle, please.
So thank you very much, Adam, and a good morning to my distinguished colleagues here on the panel. I will start the discussion by motivating why we think we really are in this world of chronic pandemics, and I will go through some of the rationale and what it implies and why we should remain prepared, we should cooperate, and we should not become complacent. So to begin, why chronic pandemics? Well, we've known for a while meaning decades, out of warnings from epidemiologists and infectious disease experts, that we were going to have eventually ongoing pandemics because of several factors. We had warnings of such pandemics in the past with the outbreak of H1N1 in 2009, before that with the outbreak of SARS in 2002, 2003. And then most recently, obviously in 2020, we had the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. SARS-CoV-2 is a novel virus. It's still adapting to humans, their new host. And while the capacity of this virus to mutate is not infinite, the virus has shown itself to be able to adapt well and has created the emergence of a number of variants of concern, the so-called VOX, which I'll go into in a little while. So this pandemic is ongoing, and for several reasons, it will still be with us for a while. The second reason why we are in this pandemic era is there are other zoonotic viruses. These are viruses that jump species. They jump from one species to another, and they may emerge, particularly with human encroachment on natural habitats, as we've been seeing, and in these natural habitats where you have species that may harbor or that may be viral repositories. So this is the warning that's been long-standing amongst the scientific community, and that warning has now been made very clear with the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. And thirdly, we do have the ever-present threat of avian flu. So this being, again, another zoonotic virus that can jump from birds and avian species to human beings and cause a lot of tragedy and a lot of problems. So we really can't escape this reality in any way. Global preparedness and coordination, when we lack global preparedness and coordination, that is precisely when we as a global community actually contribute to the spread of pandemics. And I think we saw that very clearly with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. If we just go by the numbers, a year ago, we had 132,000 cases of COVID worldwide and 5,000 deaths, whereas now we have about 125 million cases and about 3 million deaths worldwide. So that I think tells us very starkly how we have failed at global preparedness and global cooperation. We have failed on a number of fronts. We have failed on communication and transparency. We have failed on getting the right message about non-pharmacological interventions. These are the NPIs shown here on the screen. Non-pharmacological interventions, of course, are various versions of lockdowns and quarantines and sanitary cordons. The failure to correctly or to properly communicate the necessity for these measures has led to social and political issues when it comes to adhesion or adherence. In many cases, we have seen people simply not wanting to adhere. We have seen political leaders basically playing down the idea that these NPIs were necessary, and that has been a problem. We have made very little effort in the way of having global genomic surveillance. Genomic surveillance is the capacity to monitor how the virus is evolving and how it may be evolving to become, for example, more transmissible or even more capable of immune evasion. There are some countries around the world that have developed good genomic surveillance networks, but this is lacking on a global scale and we desperately need it. And finally, we've had a number of issues on vaccine distribution, which I'll get to in a moment. A bit on viruses, and this is very, very basic virology, but one thing that should be understood is that when viruses replicate, they mutate. So even within the same host, so even within, let's say, the same person who is perhaps infected by SARS-CoV-2, no single copy, so-called copy of the virus is exactly the same. So the virus in the process of replication, even within one person, it automatically is creating variants of itself. The mutations that happen in the replication process are completely random. Some or many will be neutral from the point of view of what they do to the virus's capacity. Some may be disadvantageous to the virus, and some may be advantageous to the virus. When a virus finds a new host, it is going to adapt and evolve. Over time, this is going to lead to something that we call greater viral fitness. And fitness is not synonymous with pathogenicity or with disease severity. Fitness is just the adaptation, or it refers to adaptation of the virus to its new host. We have seen, as of the end of 2020, a number of these so-called VOX, variants of concern. So as I was saying, when viruses mutate, new variants are naturally going to emerge. This is part and parcel of viral life. But there are some variants that accumulate mutations that may become or may give the virus certain advantages. And these are the so-called variants of concern. So these are variants of the virus that perhaps make it more transmissible, make it more capable of immune evasion, amongst various other factors, these two being the most prevalent and the most worrisome. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, we tend to classify, or we have been classifying, these variants of concern according to the presence of mutations in the spike protein. So I think by now everybody's fairly familiar with the virus and what it looks like, but it basically has on its surface, on its membrane, it expresses the spike protein. This is the protein that actually adapts to or engages with receptors on our cells and allows viral entry into our cells. So it's actually quite a crucial structural protein from the viral point of view and from the infection point of view. And it is mutations in this particular protein that make variants of concern when they arise. So just to call out a few of these noteworthy variants of concern, there are many actually, and this should be pointed out, there are many variants of concern that are actually popping up right now all over the world. The three that I've highlighted here on the screen are simply the ones that are being talked about the most and the ones that we know a little bit more about in terms of the scientific research that has gone into them. So the first one shown on here, which is now becoming prevalent in the US, it has already become prevalent in the UK, and it is also spreading throughout Europe, is this variant called B117. This is the so-called UK variant of concern. It emerged at the end of 2020. It's present in over 100 countries. It's been shown to be more transmissible. It's also been shown to be more dangerous. So there's scientific research showing that we should be very concerned actually about this particular variant, even though it does respond well to the vaccines that are currently being used, which is something to keep in mind. The second variant shown on here emerged in South Africa at the end of 2020. This has another name, B1351. It is not as widely disseminated as B117, but it is capable of immune escape according to various studies, and thus there's that level of concern attached to it. Finally, there's a variant that emerged, or a variant of concern that emerged in Brazil at the end of 2020. This is called P1. It is not as widely disseminated, again, as B117, but it is more transmissible. It has been found here in the US. It has also been found in Europe. There are other variants of concern. There's one that's been found in New York, and it's spreading in the US. There's one that has been found in California, and it is also spreading in the US. Again, so far, vaccines have been able to deal with these variants of concern. However, as the pandemic continues to be out of control in other places around the world, we should expect that more of these variants will arise, and we will have to think through what we will do about that and how we will handle them. Just to visualize what we're talking about when we mention the spike protein and these mutations, these are just two pictures of this gray wiggly stuff is the spike protein in its so-called pre-fusion form. So what it looks like before it undergoes some changes. And highlighted here in yellow and in blue are some of the mutations associated with the UK variant. This green wiggly stuff here is the ACE2 receptor on our cells. And this shows how the spike protein attaches to this receptor. And that attachment is what leads to viral entry into our cells. This is another picture of this. This is showing the South African variant and its mutations. And you can see that they share some similar mutations, but they have these two, but they have others which do differ. So this is just to visualize what this is all about. And here we have a picture, I think, which is quite worrisome and speaks to, I think, what Adam was saying in the beginning. At least we finally had an official from the Biden administration correctly emphasizing how important it is to distribute vaccines to the world, because otherwise we're not going to contain the pandemic. This chart is from January, but it's broadly still the same. So this is a chart of global, how we expect the calendar of global vaccinations to evolve over time. The source is the Economist Intelligence Unit. And as you can see here, even though this calendar has shifted somewhat for a few countries, it is still broadly the same that we have here. And the colors show you exactly how heterogeneous the calendar is for various parts of the world, which is very worrisome, because what this really means is that you will have perhaps a small part of the world, the darker blue part of the world shown here, being vaccinated first, But then other countries will still be lagging. And in some cases, especially if you look down here in South America, this is what's happening now. The P1 variant of concern is widespread in South America at the moment. It has brought Brazil's health system down. It's doing the same in other countries around the region. Everybody's very concerned. And this is a region that's currently lacking vaccine doses for its population, by and large, with the exception of Chile, which is a country that has been doing exceptionally well in vaccinations, but nonetheless is suffering from this infectiousness from the P1 variant, which is very, very transmissible. So there's a race right now between these variants of concern and vaccines. Some countries are being able to deal with that quite well, but most of the world is not. And so this is where we really need to be concerned. And this is where global cooperation comes in, because unless we have global cooperation and attention to how these inequalities, how these disparities in vaccine distribution, how this may impact not just inequality globally speaking, but economies, economic recoveries, the livelihoods of people in different parts of the world, and also how it threatens, if you have a certain part of the world where variants of concern are just emerging because the pandemic is uncontrolled, how this is actually a threat to the entire world, not just to that country itself. So what we need to control the COVID-19 pandemic, and keeping in mind that vaccines are key to economic recoveries, we won't have economic recoveries without widespread vaccination. So we certainly need faster and better coordinated global vaccinations. We need the availability of highly effective vaccines in low and middle income countries. I can't emphasize this point enough, because in low and middle income countries, the vaccines that we currently have, we don't really know how well they do, especially we don't know how well they do against these variants of concern. However, we do have population studies for the Pfizer vaccine, some for the Moderna vaccine. We have some studies that the CDC has just finished. There was a population study coming out of Israel with respect to the Pfizer vaccine. So we do know that the mRNA vaccines, which are the most advanced technology and vaccines that we currently have, actually do very well against most of these variants of concern, or all of these variants of concern. But we have no such information for other vaccines, and that's a problem, because we do need, these low and middle income countries to also have access to these more sophisticated vaccines, and that's just not in the cards at the moment. As I said in the beginning, we need greater efforts at genomic surveillance. We need to be able to track these variants of concern. We need to know where they are. We need to know how fast they're spreading, which parts of the world they're most present, which countries they may be threatening. There are various issues here with respect to genomic surveillance as being part and parcel of global cooperation and coordination. And finally, I will leave here a point about what my colleague Chad Bown is going to talk about in his very interesting paper with Tom Boyke, which is chapter 10 actually of our PIIE policy briefing on the chronic pandemics and what they imply, which is the need for perhaps having a global treaty that addresses many of these cooperation issues when it comes to vaccine production and vaccine distribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And again, my thanks on behalf of all of Peterson Institute team, because you've been such a leader and doing so much to educate us internally. I appreciate it very much. Chad, as Monica set it up better than I could, what is the role of international cooperation in addressing these problems?
Let me move this over here. The role of international cooperation, I think, is absolutely critical. And I'm going to walk through this new joint piece with Tom Boyke, my amazing colleague at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he is much like Monica, an expert on the global public health dimension of this. And so Tom and I first started worrying about the international cooperation part of the vaccine story almost a year ago at this time. And we published a piece last summer that essentially warned that unless we had some kind of ex-ante agreement and cooperation between countries, between the major vaccine producing countries of the world, and there's only going to be a handful of those given the nature and the complexity of vaccine production, we were likely to end up in a world with export restrictions and hoarding. And unfortunately, that's very much where we have ended up today. The point of our latest paper is not to say we told you so. In fact, I don't think we say we told you so at all in that piece. It's basically to say, okay, now that we're here, what do we do to get ourselves out of this? Even though that we're here, this is a very, very complicated story. It's not clear that even we would have had an enforceable arrangement. So let's deal with the here and now. So the problem, I'm going to focus on the supply side. Monica has explained absolutely critically why we need to get the world vaccinated on the public health side. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. I'm also going to mostly ignore the global demand side and the global distribution side, except to nod to the COVAX system that has been established to, essentially allocate doses of vaccines to countries around the world. We have the infrastructure in place. The main challenge facing COVAX is they're not getting enough doses to distribute globally. There will be separate problems given the nature of some of the vaccines on cold storage and infrastructure. It will be a challenge to vaccinate the world in especially far-flung places of the world. That's certainly, I don't mean to minimize that as a concern, but I'm gonna push away from that today and focus on how do we just get billions of doses of vaccines manufactured? Because right now, that is a key bottleneck here. So this is the world in which we live at the moment. We have these export restrictions, implicit or explicit, that are being imposed. The major vaccine producing countries aren't cooperating with one another. They're focused being primarily and not surprisingly on administering their doses locally. And to get around this, Tom and I are proposing a COVID vaccine investment and trade agreement. So this is going to be very, very specific, and I want you to hold on with me here. This is not just to say free trade is going to get us out of this and kumbaya, if we just sign an agreement at the WTO, the world will be a better place. No. We have a much more activist agreement in mind, and so let me walk you through it. To walk you through it, we need to start with understanding how vaccines are manufactured in the modern global economy, and the incredible complexity in the fragmentation that takes place through these supply chains. So there's a graphic that my wonderful colleagues at the Peterson Institute, our data visualization team, have put together to try to illustrate just how complicated this multi-step process is. But there you can see it. You have the research and development. Then you have an initial phase where the manufacturers put together kind of all of the necessary chemical ingredients requiring lots of specialized inputs, specialized capital equipment. Then it's oftentimes handed off to a separate company to do the fill and finish. You hear about the 10s or 20 or 30 million doses that are going to come out. This is assembly line procedure, lots of capital equipment needed there, and ultimately to get this thing out the door. But the point here is, I think people have in their mind big pharma, right? That if we just hand this off to big pharmaceutical companies, they'll figure it out. And the first interesting thing that I learned when researching this particular supply chain is that's not how this industry has interacted or set itself up at all nowadays. It's very, very fragmented, where you have lots of players out there that are involved in and have to be involved in a very coordinated set of activities. During a pandemic, that's extraordinarily challenging. So one of the things that I thought I would do, and what we do in the paper, is to kind of walk through how this developed in the United States over the course of 2020. And this is, I think, largely to the credit of the Trump administration, recognizing the complexity of the vaccine manufacturing supply chain in the United States. And so here I put together a table of all of the different ways in which they subsidized specific elements of that supply chain. So you go back again to this complicated process. You got lots of inputs being put together. Well, what they did is they didn't just hand over a bunch of money to big pharmaceutical companies. They actually subsidized each of the input providers along each of the steps of the supply chain, recognizing that for the pharmaceutical companies to be able to produce more output, they were going to need more inputs, and you didn't want to have that ultimately be a bottleneck. So effectively in 2020, the United States government, through this thing called Operation Warp Speed, and through also use of what's called the Defense Production Act, managed to not only, kind of help speed the findings of the scientists, right? So once they had invented these vaccines through clinical trials to figure out which ones worked effectively, which ones didn't necessarily work effectively, but then managed to scale up manufacturing in the United States quite quickly and to make sure that there were enough inputs to be able to produce hundreds of millions of doses. And this is not trivial, right? In any given year, the experts in vaccines will tell you we produce globally, 1.5 billion doses of vaccines, primarily for, kids, right? Immunizations. What we need to do globally this time around, depending on if it's a 1 dose or a 2 dose, right, and if we need boosters, could be, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 billion doses of vaccines in any given year. So orders of magnitude larger in terms of the amount of scaling up that needs to happen. So this is what the United States did to its credit. Now, we can quibble, and in earlier pieces, Tom and I have quibbled with the Trump administration's America first, America alone approach, and certainly not being the one that we should be pursuing on public health, global public health grounds. But in terms of scaling up manufacturing, I think there are some lessons to be learned here that the rest of the world can adapt. But here's the challenge. The United States is a massively large economy, has a massively large manufacturing sector for all of these pharmaceutical ingredients, most of them that you need. But for the rest of the world, when they scale up that production through these supply chains, it's not all going to be located in one country. You're going to have country A has done the research and development. Maybe this is BioNTech in Germany. Country B, they make the capital equipment, the bioreactors. Well, those are highly specialized, maybe in the United States. The lipids, they may be made in the UK. Maybe the vials, those kinds of things are made in some other country. In any case, you can see the concern. Once we have not only this fragmented model of production and this complicated supply chain, but one that crosses borders, now you have to involve multiple governments when you come to the point of needing to scale up and coordinate that production. And so when you take this model, which is the model out there, we can't reinvent the wheel kind of mid-crisis, right? We've got to deal with the supply chain for vaccines as we've inherited it at this moment in time. This is what we're going to have to do. So the policy implications of this is that all of the countries, the governments that are part of this supply chain are going to need to do their part, basically to subsidize, to scale up whatever it is that they do to contribute. And without that coordination and cooperation, if you don't have that, you're going to have everybody subsidizing too little, not everybody doing their part, too few of some of the inputs necessary so that the final assemblers of these vaccines aren't going to be able to have everything they need to put it together. And arguably thus far, the lack of cooperation by governments has led to kind of this paralysis where they're not sufficiently doing the public investment necessary, the subsidization necessary to scale up the production of inputs. The threat of export restrictions is also contributing to this. And then there's going to be separate problems along the way that some of these countries may not have the fiscal resources, and there's going to be the need for international transfers to make sure all the subsidies happen in the right place. So what we propose in this piece, and this is my final slide and where I'll end, is a CVIDA, right? A COVID-19 vaccine investment and trade agreement. It would leverage the distribution scheme based on global public health that COVAX has already established, so no need to reinvent the wheel there. But then it would do things like coordinating investments across countries. This is the investment piece to make sure that all of those inputs get scaled up. It would deal with the export restriction concerns explicitly, saying countries, you become a part of this thing if you actually ex post engage in export restrictions or are on that path, then we will withhold the inputs from you. And that will ensure If you don't have the inputs, you can't make the exports, the vaccines to export. That will ensure that we actually keep the supply chains moving. And we call for obviously lots of transparency in this process in order to get governments and everyone to buy in. They have to have information so that they can build up this trust. And then you're going to need to have somebody, and we've seen, in the United States and in Europe, various high-level political appointees be put in charge of administering this process, right? And you're going to need to have some of that at the international level as well to help deal with input bottlenecks that are inevitably going to arise, the reallocation of inputs since we don't have good secondary markets in these places, and it being adaptive, right? You see, even in these rich countries, stories every week about hiccups that have come up with the manufacturing process. The latest one, obviously, here in the United States was the production of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine at the Emergent plant, right? And the need to say that one was scheduled to produce both the J&J vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine here in the United States. It makes sense now, since the AstraZeneca vaccine still hasn't been authorized in the United States, to now allocate resources at that plant just for the J&J one. So this has to be adaptive as well. In any case, I'll end there. But thanks to especially Adam for spearheading this project, and really, and Monica and Maury as well for taking the lead on seeing it through. And thanks for including me.
Thank you, Chad. I will now turn to Jacob, who's in the mesh of having to see how nation states and international agreements work in vaccine distribution in Europe. Jacob, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. I will, as was mentioned, hopefully if I can get this thing to work, here we go. I'm going to focus on the European experience, which, as Adam said, highlights some of the complexities of doing international stuff across borders in the middle of a pandemic. But I would also say, and just basically the one line of what I'm going to say is that, and as I also have the title here saying, the European vaccination experience has been troubling. There has been a lot of hiccups, as Chad mentioned, but I would also say that I think we have passed the nadir, so to speak, and that actually in the end, Europe is going to end up having a generalized reopening of the economy towards the end of the second quarter of this year, which isn't going to be far off countries like the United States, UK, or others, and certainly well ahead of most of the peoples in the world that you heard also Monica talk about. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing of this idea of doing pan-European vaccine procurement at the EU level, then a little bit about where the vaccine rollout is right now, and then towards the end offer some lessons for the future that thankfully ties, in my opinion, very well in with the agenda that Chad laid out. The first thing to keep in mind, actually, when you understand European procurement is actually, if you remember the chart that Chad put up, the timeline for when Operation Warp Speed began to basically subsidize different aspects of vaccine development and production in the United States. Well, compare that to the European Union. The Commission was tasked to initiate this vaccine procurement only in the middle of June 2020, and it was then tasked to do it within the existing budget, which, mind you, for those of you who know the European Union, know that the existing budget was actually laid down as early as 2013. I shall spare you the intricacies of how they did it, but they came up with a supplementary budget actually as early as April of 2.7 billion euros that was supposed to cover not just vaccines, but also COVID-19 treatments, production scale up, and pretty much any other pandemic issue that, quote unquote, Europe needed to fund together. So there was no specific EU vaccine budget allocation. And it actually also, as I said, this work only started level in the middle of June. more incriminating even, I would argue, is that as the Commission over the course of the summer of 2020, realizing, of course, what was going on with Operation Warp Speed in the United States, also in the UK, Israel, and others, and I think also importantly recognizing that actually at the time it was becoming clearer that some of these vaccines were actually going to work pretty soon. So the production scale up was going to be even more acute as a result of that ultimately good news. So they repeatedly asked European member states for more money, but they didn't get it, which of course has the implication that when various European leaders today, 6 or 9 months later, are all up in arms about not spending enough, and there's all these problems with the vaccine procurement process. It's essentially covering up for their own mistake of being unwilling to take the prerequisite fiscal risks back when it mattered, which was last summer, which also highlights this more general issue that the Commission is actually a poor risk taker. It's poorly equipped to therefore take very large financial risks in the middle of a situation of acute uncertainty, which of course is the situation in the middle of any pandemic. So there's a lot of debate going back and forth, but in my opinion, if you look at the data, and again recall the chart that Chad put up, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the European, they call it the emergency supply instrument, and the broader European vaccine development subsidization process was both much later than, and by that I mean several months, than was the case in the United States, and certainly on a per capita basis, it was very much also smaller. Because remember that the adult population of the EU is about 40% larger than in the United States. So I would say, as a framing thing, about the best thing you could say about this very ad hoc, suddenly sort of improvised setup by the European Commission is that it was actually probably better, much, much better than the alternative. Because if you think that the problems that Europe has experienced in the last couple of months were bad, imagine if it had been the tasks of individual member states instead. I think that's really the key part. So what happened? Well, basically, the Commission signed what they call advance purchases agreement, which aren't really agreements to buy vaccines, but they're options to buy them that they then give to member states that could choose to exercise the options, or, and this is important when it comes to distribution, sell them to one another afterwards. And what you can see here is just the 6 vaccines that the Commission has to date signed a purchase agreement with. And if you look at it, it's pretty clear that there were issues. The first one they signed with was AstraZeneca. Well, AstraZeneca obviously has been plagued by many of the supply chain issues that Chad mentioned. The second one that the Commission signed up with was Sanofi GSK. Well, that vaccine has basically failed. And then the third one they signed up with Janssen. Well, that has only now been approved. And then the 3 last ones that the Commission signed up with were the actual ultimately mRNA vaccines that became the first ones to market. But most of those, in fact, all of them were only signed in November. Again, compare that to the chart that Chad showed you. So there is no doubt that price and also product liability, which was something that the Commission could not take on, did matter a lot. And there was clearly an expectation in Europe over the course of this summer and early fall, when we were not yet in the situation of the second wave, and therefore economies were not in lockdown, that price did matter. It did play a role because there was a fixed budget at the Commission level, and we have subsequently learned that also many member states had fixed vaccine allocation budgets. So price did matter, and it took a lot of time. And then the additional issue was that the AstraZeneca vaccine is cheaper and easier to manage than the mRNA vaccines, which meant that many member states disproportionately focused on it, which of course meant that when by January 2021, the supplies of this vaccine were drastically cut back, a lot of them were left with severely depleted supplies. But again, remember, if individual member states had been in charge, they would have been even worse off. So there were a lot of issues, and quite frankly, also some bad luck with regard from the Commission when you think about AstraZeneca and the Sanofi vaccines being the two first ones and what subsequently happened. But I would say that, again, ultimately where we are is not actually so bad, because if you focus, then you can see here, this is the latest data for the vaccine rollout here. Here I've taken both first and second jabs to sort of account for the fact that different countries have different rollout strategies, etc. And as you can see, and I've also put in the US and the UK on the far right of the chart. What you can see here is that there are some member states far to the left that are clearly lagging. Bulgaria, Latvia, to some extent Croatia, are clearly doing worse than the EU average. And there are some member states that are doing quite a lot better. In fact, Malta has reached levels not far already, not far off the United States. Hungary, which, as you know, has also taken a lot of vaccines from Russia and China, have also done well. And then you have a very large group of countries, basically everybody else in all the large member states, that are at levels roughly of 1/3 of the US and UK levels. So that's the bad news. The good news, however, is that things are going to improve pretty significantly going forward. This is a chart that shows you the vaccine production deliveries for the first and second quarter under various scenarios. First, on the far left, you have the approximately 100 million doses that were delivered in the first quarter. And the second bar is if you take the delivered doses and add to them the 77 million doses that the European Union located facilities exported out of the country. So basically, if you had adopted an American strategy of vaccinating Europeans first, how many vaccines would you have had? You would have had about 175 million or 180 million doses available in the first quarter, which would have put you somewhere around 30 to 35% of fully vaccinated, rather than the just below 20% that you're at now. And then you can also sort of imagine, since there is a narrative now in Europe that says that, well, if only AstraZeneca had delivered on everything it promised, then we would be at the same level as the US and the UK. That's the third bar, which shows you that basically if the EU had been, if you like, a vaccine nationalist, and also had received all the supply from AstraZeneca, it would have had about 230 million doses available, which again would have put it somewhere around 40% of the total population, which again is not at the range of where Europe and the UK is. The good news, however, is going forward, you can see that there is a very dramatic acceleration between the first pillar and the fourth pillar. That's basically the actually expected deliveries. And as you can see, they're about to quadruple. So you're going to have the equivalent of about 400 million doses delivered. That's when you factor in that the Janssen vaccine is a single shot, delivered in the second quarter relative to the 100 million in the first quarter. And again, if you then imagine that AstraZeneca delivered all that had been contracted, it would have been a bit larger. But the bottom line is that there's going to be a very dramatic acceleration in vaccine supply going forward from the first to the second quarter. So what does this mean? Well, the Commission and most member states have a target. They want to basically vaccinate about 70% of the adult population. They say by the summer or before the summer, depending on who you talk to. That's the equivalent of just over 500 million vaccines, if you assume that all vaccines are two-jab vaccines. And actually, Europe is going to be able to do that. it's going to be able to vaccinate, in principle, on average, 70% of the adult population by the end of the second quarter, assuming that member states actually do this. That actually puts these vaccines into the arms of Europeans. Again, the last two bars here shows you what would happen if everything had gone well in Europe and that it had adopted, sort of a vaccine nationalist strategy. Well, then Europe could conceivably have been at around 100% vaccinated at the end of the second quarter. So what this ultimately means, therefore, in my opinion, is that for all the problems that Europe has had so far, it looks like it's going to be able to reach its targets, and therefore, in my opinion, going to be able to have, as I said earlier, a generalized reopening of the economy, sometimes in late second quarter, which is pretty much what you're going to have in the US and the UK. What is, however, clear is that if you had more vaccinations already done, it seems probable that the onslaught of the second wave that is currently unfolding in many European countries would probably have been less virulent. But to that, I would say that knowing that this was going to be the case, it's pretty clear that a lot of European governments chose not to lock down adequately in the face of the onslaught of the more infectious British variant. So very quickly here at the end, what are the lessons for the future? Well, I think we should first of all be clear that the European Union, particularly in a pandemic, it's clear that it's not a single country. It doesn't have a single government that can, make everything work in lockstep. So what it means is, therefore, it's going to be healthcare basically belongs to the member states. So national health authorities are going to continue to take different decisions on vaccines. Leaders will say and do whatever they want. And there are limits, even within the EU, to how much you can coordinate in the middle of a national pandemic. Yet, the Commission has made a proposal for a new sort of bio-preparedness unit. They call it the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, or HERA, because I guess you want to have a Greek goddess involved somewhere here. I think that's a good idea. And the way to think of it in an American context is a little bit like, the existing BARDA agency, but without the national security priorities and issues and authorities, no PrEP Act, and certainly no Defense Authorization Act that Chad also mentioned. So there is clearly a limit to what such a new agency can do when it comes to beefing up the supply chain. But I would also say that there is a significant deficiency in this proposal, namely that this new HERA doesn't have any budget. And as you saw in the beginning, there are significant issues. There were very significant money issues. So the proposal that I have made in this manuscript is that you give this new HERA agency a conditional accessible budget of up to 20 billion euros that becomes available once you have another pandemic, when the WHO announces a global pandemic and the EU Council agrees that this pandemic also affects European populations directly, then the Commission can basically issue up to 20 billion euros in new debt and fund all the kind of vaccine research that it couldn't do in real time during this pandemic. And then finally, I want to make a passionate argument that vaccine-free trade, if you like, which despite the rhetoric is actually what the European Union has practiced, has actually served it very well, in my opinion, because it has exported a lot of vaccines during the first quarter. But as you saw, it has also been able to scale up very dramatically in the second quarter. And that is precisely enabled so because no countries have retaliated against it for export, vaccine protectionism, and it has been able to import a lot of ingredients to facilitate this scale up. And then I think going forward, recognizing that the European Union is not like the United States, the country that let's face it, overpays for all the drugs that it buys, and therefore you will always in the United States have very large concentrations of pharmaceutical production, etc. That's not the case in the EU, but if the EU becomes one of the locations in the world where private pharmaceutical companies and suppliers they can locate with a relative degree of political certainty that protectionism will not materialize, then Europe has, I think, a better future to remain, probably, at least if you believe the Commission's targets, which is that the EU production capacity should be up to 3 billion doses of vaccines at the end of this year, has actually a real possibility of coming to fruition. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacob. So we just have 5 minutes left, and I'm been appointed. Adam had to run off, and so I've been appointed as interim moderator. So let me do the following. There's a couple of questions that are addressed to me. I will take those first, and then I think most of the rest of the questions Monica can go into. And so we'll turn it back over to Monica. And so first of all, let me say thanks to all the audience members. I know we have a tremendous number of experts in the webinar, and so we appreciate all the feedback. Okay, so the questions for me, one from Nabila Alam, good to see you, is would you say, Chad, that TRIPS is not the holdup since they have provisions for parallel imports and compulsory licensing, right? So I didn't talk about TRIPS and this proposed TRIPS waiver as being a potential solution to the shortage of vaccines and manufacturing. And I think at this stage, at least in the short run, it isn't a problem, right? What's different about vaccines relative to other pharmaceuticals is it's not just a recipe that you can hand off to somebody else and to say, go ahead and make this. It involves a lot of really strict regulatory oversight. And so there's really only a handful of places in the world. And I think the evidence of that is look at the companies, the expert companies that have been doing it during the pandemic, and look at the hiccups that even they have run into, right? We don't just want to, I think, start allowing mom and pop and Chad's pharmaceutical company to start making vaccines when we already have all of these other regulatory issues and concerns that Monica mentioned about vaccine hesitancy, et cetera. So I don't think the waiver is the solution. And even if you needed to waive IP, you've got these existing compulsory licensing provisions in the TRIPS agreement that you could do so. A question from Kent Jones. Given the failure of the Trump administration to manage other elements of the pandemic, what was it about Operation Warp Speed and the Defense Production Act that worked? I think that we'll have to wait and see. I'm sure we will, as we get better data over time, we'll be able to poke holes in both of those as well. My own sense is they had more time, right? So you knew that the vaccines, even in the best case scenario, because of the length of these clinical trials that they have to go through, weren't going to get authorized until late in 2021. And so some of the auxiliary inputs that you needed, you could plan ahead for those. We have experience there. Obviously, we do a lot of this FDA stuff in the United States. So some of that, I think it was, we didn't hear about this in real time. So it was not front page headlines where you had political officials get involved. It was, from what I've been able to figure out, very much experts, right, and career government officials. And they had, logistics specialists from both HHS apparently and the Department of Defense focused on this and resolving bottlenecks. So I think they took advantage of good government civil servants in that space. And then the last question for me, should the emergent plant be allocated to AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson? I think there's trade-offs, obviously, and maybe I was a little too flip with my answer. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the J&J vaccine also is single shot in one dose, and so is different from that perspective as well. Okay, I'll turn it over to Monica if you want to take some of the other questions. I can read them, but I think in the interest of time, I'll let you both take whatever questions you want and then wrap us up.
Okay, so I've got them here. There are a couple of questions. I think they're related. One is, can we beat COVID for good? Will this be an ongoing race between vaccines and new mutations? I think here the jury's out. We don't know. A lot of the answer to this question depends on what we learn of the other vaccines that are in use. We have learned a lot from the mRNA vaccines, particularly because Israel was out in front and vaccinated most of its population. So we actually have populational studies out of Israel upon which we can look at the scientific evidence and look at the effectiveness of that vaccine. The same goes for the 2 mRNA vaccines here in the US and the CDC population studies that have been done. With respect to the other vaccines, we simply don't know. There is a scientific issue, which I'm not going to get into, about which form of the spike protein you actually use in the vaccines, whether it's a pre-fusion form or a post-fusion form. The mRNA vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, Johnson, uses the pre-fusion form of the spike protein, which seems to induce a better immune response, whereas other vaccines are using the post-fusion version of the spike protein. So again, the jury's out on how exactly these vaccines are going to perform. And depending on how they do perform, we can have more optimistic, middle of the way, less pessimistic scenarios with respect to how long this particular pandemic is going to take to be controlled. So I think with that, I have answered at least a couple of questions which were very similar in nature. There is a question here about the geopolitics of Russia and China becoming major vaccine producers and exporters. While this is true, and they're exporting a lot of vaccines to developing countries and to middle income poor countries, it is also true that these vaccines, again, looking at this perspective of what type of the pre-fusion, post-fusion spike protein they use, these vaccines are using post-fusion proteins in their formulations. And therefore, again, we don't know exactly how these vaccines perform against the existing variants of concern and any future variants of concern that may emerge. So the jury is still out on these particular population studies and the extent to which, the current hold that Russia and China have on much of the world that hasn't really received vaccines, whether that hold remains or does not, depending on how vaccine distribution changes, and some of these countries are able to access vaccines which seem to be at least better at containing the variants of concern. I will, I guess, end here unless Jacob wants to add anything by encouraging, yeah.
No, I mean, I would just say that, very quickly, there's a couple of EU-related questions. I think one thing, just to follow up on what Monica said, look, Russia doesn't have any large-scale domestic vaccine capacity. So to the extent that Vladimir Putin has sent, vaccines around the world, he has done so pretty explicitly at the cost of his own population. Now, he can do that, but, I think that the window for these countries to play, vaccine diplomacy or geopolitics with it is rapidly closing as US and EU supply and fully vaccinated domestic patients come into gear over the coming months. There's a question about the HERA unit in the EU. Yes, it will be approved. In my opinion, it's simply a matter of the sort of political calendar. But as I said, the key part is if it's approved without budget, an independent earmark budget, it's probably not going to be that relevant. And then finally, on this issue that the EU has set up, valid, sort of customer relationship with countries, I think so. I mean, I think that there are many countries that will ultimately have been supplied by the EU during the first quarter, while they were great, clamoring for domestic supply of vaccines in the EU. And I think countries will remember that. And therefore the EU will have, in my opinion, as I said, derive some long-term benefit from this. Oh, Monica, you're muted, Monica.
That's the typical Zoom thing. So let me thank our colleagues and for a great event and great presentations. The PIIE Briefing, Economic Policy for a Pandemic Age, is now online and can be downloaded and read. All of the chapters, those that were presented today, plus a number of others, are there to be read. And I will invite all of you who have been with us today watching to come back on Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time for a second round of economic policy for a pandemic age. So thank you very much, and we are adjourned.